Greetings and welcome to the pre-concert video for the next performance in the Victoria's Symphony's virtual season. I'm your host, as always, Bob Fraser, your bass trombonist. This one airs on Thursday, May the 13th at 7:30 p.m. and it features the works of these two composers, Georg Philipp Telemann and Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. Now you're probably thinking that's odd. They both have the middle name Philipp, spelled with 3 P's. That's not a coincidence. Telemann was a contemporary and friend of the famous early 18th century composer Johann Sebastian Bach, who was, of course, the father of Carl Philipp Emanuel, who is just known as Emanuel to his contemporaries. Now, Telemann was one of the godparents of the young Bach. That's why they shared the middle name Philipp. There's your first trivial fact for the talk. I'll start with a few words about Telemann. I think the only time I've ever spoken about him in a pre-concert talk was once, and that was about 3 years ago, which is quite surprising, really. Telemann was born in Magdeburg, which is in the northeastern part of Germany. He was born in 1681, almost 4 years to the day before his friend J.S. Bach. He was born into what we would consider an upper middle class family of the time. Most of his ancestors were very well educated people. Many of them were clerics in the church, including his own father, Heinrich. Telemann seemed to have a fascination with music from a young age. Now, he did have a great-grandfather who was a musician, and Telemann himself claimed he got his musical genes from his mother. But on the whole, his family discouraged him from studying music. They even went so far as to confiscate instruments from him. He did, however, have some good teachers in his general education that recognized the value of music education for its own sake. And his high school, which they called Gymnasium in Germany at the time, he dabbled in a lot of different instruments. He learned not only the keyboard and the stringed instruments, but most of the wind instruments as well. And even my instrument, the bass trombone, specifically, I'm assuming that his parents confiscated that instrument quite quickly. I was really surprised to learn that in my research because Telemann didn't leave behind any music with trombone parts, except for maybe one short concerto for a recorder that has a wind orchestra accompaniment. Telemann ended up making his career as a composer in Frankfurt in the early part of his career, where he worked as the music director of 2 different churches, and then later in the city of Hamburg for the rest of the last 40 some odd years of his life. He worked as a cantor. I'll show you that word, cantor with a K. We think of a cantor as the lead singer in a worship service, especially in the Jewish tradition. You think of the cantor of a synagogue. But in the Lutheran church of the 17th and 18th centuries, a cantor was not only the music director of a church or a number of churches. In fact, Telemann was responsible for the music at 5 churches in Hamburg. The cantor was also responsible for music education in whichever educational establishments the church supervised. And he would often be called upon to provide music for secular or civic functions. Around the time that Telemann went to Hamburg, which was in 1721, he won the cantor job in Leipzig at the famous Thomaskirche, which is the Church of St. Thomas. He ended up turning it down. His new employer in Hamburg offered him a raise in salary to keep him, so there was a bidding war basically for Telemann. The job in Leipzig ended up going to a composer named Christoph Graupner, who also turned it down. And then it was offered to the 3rd choice candidate, who was, you guessed it, J.S. Bach. History doesn't look so good on that particular job selection committee that Bach was their 3rd choice. Telemann lived a very long life. He died at the ripe age of 86. His career was well over 50 years of writing. But even if you take into consideration the length of his career, His output as a composer makes him possibly the most prolific composer in history. And by prolific, I mean if you take the total number of minutes of all of his compositions and divide them by the number of years that he wrote, he has the most number of minutes of composition per year. He wrote over 3,000 works that we know of. That's basically an average of more than one completed composition for every single week of his career. Surprisingly, though, our orchestra has played very little Telemann, only about a dozen different works in our 80-year history. There's a bottomless well of music out there, not just from Telemann, and we've barely scratched the surface of it. The orchestra is going to perform a suite by Telemann, and sometimes these are called ouverture suites or just overtures. It's a suite, like so many suites of the Baroque era, and it's based on different dance forms. This one has 8 movements. There's an overture, a courante, a gavotte, a branle, or a brawl. If you remember back to my talk about the Suite Française of Poulenc earlier, that our wind and brass players performed this season, you'll remember what a brawl is. It has a sarabande, a fantaisie, a set of minuets, and the finale movement is called the rossignol, which is the song of the nightingale. And that'll remind you a little bit of music from the Four Seasons concertos of Vivaldi that we started the season with. Most of these dance forms, of course, come from France, and Telemann was one of the first German composers to make this suite form popular in Germany. Now, I told you that he was prolific. He wrote around 125 of these suites, just this one type of orchestral suite. In program notes, you'll see this next to the suite, and it has TWV 55G2. You remember my talk about Bach? I told you that BWV means Bach-Werke-Verzeichnis. Well, no surprise, TWV means Telemann-Werke-Verzeichnis, the catalog of Telemann's works. The number 55 is just the category of work, in this case, suites. So opera has another number, and chamber music of smaller forces has another number. So the 55 is the category of work. The G2 means that this is the second one in the key of G major. If it were in the key of G minor, it would have a lowercase g next to it. There are actually 13 of these suites in just the key of G major and 9 in the key of G minor. So that's what you have to go through to catalog almost 3,000 different pieces of music. And then, of course, this was done long after Telemann's death. It was a huge job. So there's your trivial fact number 2. Now you know what all those bizarre numbers are in your program notes. Speaking of bizarre, that is the nickname given to this suite, La Bizarre. Now I can't really find too much in the way of explanation from sources as to why it got dubbed La Bizarre. Charming, yes. Unexpected in places, of course, yes. But hardly bizarre. I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to guess that the title comes from what the musicians must have thought of the branle movement, the brawl. I'm going to show you the music for it here. This is modern notation of the music. Like all of his string suites, it has 4 parts, 2 violin parts on the top, a viola part underneath that, and the bottom is a bass part. That would have been doubled at the octave by cellos and basses. The bass is figured, meaning it has these little numerical symbols for the keyboard player to help them improvise an accompanying part called a continuo part. The original of this actually doesn't even have those numbers. The keyboard player would have to figure it out themselves. Now the bizarre thing about this, if you look at it, is that each part has a different time signature. I think it's just Telemann being silly. Now, the 6/4 time signature, which is in the second violin part, is really the same thing as the 6/8 time signature in the bass. It's just that the 8th note in one staff equals the same duration as a quarter note in the other. The real fun in this is the rhythmic interplay between the bars and parts that are divided into multiples of 2, like the top line, and the viola part, those all have 4 or 8 or 16 rhythmic divisions in each bar. And those that are divided into multiples of 3, like the seconds and the basses, who have 6 divisions in each bar. So this is what this sounds like. Those rhythms sort of bump and grind a little bit against each other. So that gives you an idea of what you're in for. This is really a delightful piece, and just as I was preparing this video, I got to hear some of the audio from my colleagues' recording that you're going to hear, and it sounds glorious, so you're in for a real treat. First up on the program, though, is the Emanuel Bach Cello Concerto in A minor, and this features our principal cellist, Brian Yoon. Emanuel Bach, he's usually called C.P.E Bach by musicians. We use their initials a lot of the time to keep all of the different Bachs straight. Truth be told, we would have to use more than just that to keep track of all of them. One of the more majorly respected encyclopedias of music, and it's a source that I use a lot when I prepare these talks, is called the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. It's now known as Grove Music Online. It's published by Oxford University. Now, Groves has extensive biographies on 14 Bachs who are related to Johann Sebastian, including his son Emanuel. And it has little short biographical sketches of what they know of around 80, that's 80, different musicians or composers in Bach's family tree, stretching from the 16th to the 19th centuries. That doesn't even include the women in the family or the ones who married into it that had enormous musical influence, like Anna Magdalena, who was J.S. Bach's second wife. There were so many Bachs in the music business in that region of Germany alone that people in some towns just used the term Bach as a generic term for musician. If you saw someone playing an instrument, you'd say, oh, he's another Bach. So back to C.P.E., back to Emanuel Bach. He was the last surviving son of J.S. Bach's first wife, Maria Barbara Bach, who died in 1720 when Emanuel was 6 years old. Between Bach's 2 wives, he fathered 20 children. Sadly, only 10 of them made it to adulthood. Child mortality rates were much higher in those pre-vaccine days. Emanuel and his half-brother, Johann Christian Bach, are probably the 2 most recognized, or at least the most prolific composers among J.S.'s sons. As you would guess, Emanuel got a lot of his education from his father. He was a student at the school in Leipzig, where his father became the cantor in 1721, as I just mentioned. Remember, he was the third choice. Interestingly, Emmanuel ended up getting a law degree. Now, musicians didn't have a great deal of social status back then. I'm rolling my eyes at that. I could say not much has changed. So having a major academic credential like that would have helped him, but he never actually practiced law. He became one of his century's leading keyboard experts. His method book that he wrote on the keyboard was studied by musicians like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Emmanuel spent the first 30 years of his career in the city of Berlin, where he was employed by the Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, who later became Frederick the Great. Emmanuel was sometimes called the Berlin Bach because of this, and his half-brother was called the London Bach. The last 20 years of Emmanuel's life were spent in Hamburg, where he succeeded his godfather, Georg Philipp Telemann, as the Kapellmeister in that city. Now, as you would guess, Emmanuel didn't want to become just a carbon copy of his dad. Like most kids, he rebelled a little bit against his parents. So the style of Emmanuel's composition started branching out a little bit into new territory. How best to explain this? This maybe oversimplifies it a lot, but I'll have a crack at it. When we think of Emmanuel's father, J.S. Bach, we think of very thick textures in music. You especially think of Bach as a writer of fugues, you know, those polyphonic compositions where all the voices have equal weight. When we move ahead to composers like Mozart, who is pretty much the poster child for what I call the classical period in music, Mozart also wrote polyphony like this too, but he is more remembered for music that is simpler in its layout. It might have only one prominent line, usually the top voice, that's simply accompanied underneath. Melody became less jagged, melody became less angular. I'll show you an example from this cello concerto. The opening orchestral introduction before the solo cello enters sounds very much like something Dad would have written. It might even remind you a little bit of the D minor keyboard concerto that Angela Hewitt performed earlier this season. When the cello comes in, the texture is much lighter, just the cello and a simple accompaniment underneath it. And the cello line is much smoother, and it's much more vocal in its concept than the introduction. I'm going to show you this in a little video clip with the score, and the score is reduced into a piano part, so it makes it a little easier to read, and it takes up less room on your screen. Now, I'd say that this concerto is a nice illustration of the bridge between the Baroque era of music history and the classical era of history. So it definitely has elements of both of those things. For example, the Cello Concerto has cadenzas in it, which, are just the cello is all alone improvising a passage. And that was a new element. I'm going to finish this video by mentioning that both of these works are Victoria Symphony premieres. Now, I looked up our repertoire history and I found neither one of these works there. There's still some work to be done completing our repertoire history, but I'm pretty sure that we've never performed these works. I mentioned before that Telemann is known to have left us over 3,000 pieces. Even that is just a drop in the ocean of music that's out there waiting to be explored. I hope that you're enjoying this virtual season. We're almost to the end of it, and I hope that it's given you a little bit of a chance to hear some repertoire that we normally wouldn't do. So I'm going to see you on the next one, and enjoy.